and welcome to ERDC LinkedIn Live event. This is our fourth in a series of discussions we're having on the subject of climate change. My name is Todd Bridges. I'm the Army's Senior Research Scientist for Environmental Science, and I'm serving as the guest host for this LinkedIn Live event with Dr. Edmond Russo, who is the director of ERDC's Environmental Laboratory. And I'd like to welcome you, Edmond, to this conversation on climate change and provide you with an opportunity to introduce yourself to our audience today, where you've been and what you've been doing for the last, 20 years or so.
Sure. Thank you, Todd. Appreciate the opportunity to have a conversation today with you on this very important topic. Going back in my career, I started out of a school from LSU in Baton Rouge and a degree in civil engineering, where I spent about 2 years with Fugaro McClellan Southeast as a geotechnical engineer. And then in about 1992, I joined the Corps of Engineers New Orleans district, performing dredging engineering, plans and specifications, design and contracting. And I progressed on from there to a planning study manager for coastal wetlands restoration in Louisiana. From there, I moved on to being an operations manager for our critical navigation infrastructure in coastal Louisiana, managing 10 different projects in Southeast Louisiana for navigation. From there, I made my way to the Coastal and Hydraulics Lab as the chief of coastal engineering branch, serving several years there, really right in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, performing some critical technical director project management work on the Louisiana Coastal Protection and Restoration Project. From there, I progressed to become chief of the division in Environmental Lab on ecosystem engineering and evaluation, whereby I got to work very closely with yourself and others in the Environmental Lab. In the last 6.5 years following my time at Environmental Lab, I was the deputy district engineer for planning, programs, and project management at Galveston District, where we had some actually deep immersion of ERDC support in the work that we did there, important work on the coast of Texas. And in the last year, I've been back at the Environmental Lab as the EL director.
Well, thanks for providing, I think that's important context, for the discussion that we're having today, because you've, occupied and served the Corps of Engineers and the country through a whole variety of different roles. And I think those roles are going to, express themselves in our discussion today from this big topic of climate change.
Absolutely.
And, the first installment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 6th assessment report. I mean, this has been going on for a long time, a few decades now, of these regular updates on the status of climate science and the reality of climate change. And earlier this month, this first installment of the 6th assessment report came out. And this first installment really does urge a ramping up, some urgency be taken with respect to climate change. And there are two broad areas of activity related to addressing climate change. The first being, mitigation actions that can be taken to reduce carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And the second broad category is adaptation. That is, actions and interventions to reduce risks associated with climate change. So in this context, how is this big topic of climate change being addressed by ERDC and ERDC's researchers?
Well, Todd, I'd like to go back a little bit. You had mentioned the IPCC reports and that they've been going on for a while. This most recent report by Work Group 1 establishes the physical science basis for our understanding on this important topic of climate change and its impacts. The report basically states that human influence on climate change is unequivocal, and that all of government approach, in fact, all of the world approach is needed to address climate change and its impacts. Roll the tape a little bit backward from there is the executive orders that the administration rolled out on 13990 and 14008, which really speak to the need for addressing climate change, ensuring that in that process we address environmental and infrastructure sustainability, energy resilience, and social equity in the process of managing our nation's water resources and military infrastructure. Going back many years, the Corps of Engineers in its legacy studies used to look at one single most probable future. Well, we realized through reports like the IPCC submit and develop that the future is very complex and uncertain, and that there's a potential range of outcomes that could occur based on climate change and its impacts, and that going forward beyond these legacy studies was WRDA 2014, which specified that the Corps of Engineers should transform how it looks at water resources management and conduct studies more efficiently and expediently, but that at the same time we needed to explore multiple futures to understand how project plans would be impacted by the uncertainties that are involved with those scenarios. Well, how did we get started on that road? Actually, following Hurricane Katrina in the Louisiana Coastal Protection and Restoration Study, that was one of the first forays into really looking at a broad set of considerations such as return period coastal storms of a range of magnitudes, as well as the issue of sea level rise at the time. Now it's relative sea level change, so we've expanded that definition. But what is the multiple lines of defense strategy between coastal wetlands restoration and management and structural measures for reducing coastal flood risks to inhabitations and development to avert damages and life safety issues? And so that was the first look into how we examine alternatives across a range of potential futures to ensure that robustness in plan development. That report was intended to inform policymakers quantitatively on this topic so that we could better understand the options for risk reduction and ensure that we understand what residual risk means, as well as to engender risk communications with those of the interested and affected parties. Following that, we take a path down the next step, which was a project in the Hampton Roads area and at Norfolk Naval Station, which took it a step further to look at risk quantification of coastal military installations and their assets and capabilities in the face of return period coastal storms and relative sea level change. So that report, that was the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program that it was conducted under for the DoD. And the idea was to then take that LACPR concept a step further and start looking at tiered vulnerability and system scale risk assessment for multiple objectives over the life cycle of a project to understand long-term sustainability and resilience. So you can see the topics expanding and evolving there, and it allows us to then understand for a system scale approach, what's the adaptive capacity and tipping points to failure into the future for those combinations of coastal storms and relative sea level change. And then how do we answer important questions about what do we do about that into the future? And so it becomes a value-laden risk type of assessment for management purposes. Following that, in more recent times, we've seen the production of the Defense Climate Adaptation Tool, which is a regional scale screening type of tool that allows us to understand vulnerabilities, which include exposure to hazards, climate change hazards, the sensitivity of our natural and built infrastructure to those hazards, exposure, and then how adaptable or adaptive and adaptable are those assets, those natural resources, that built infrastructure to those climate hazards. And the climate hazards are wide ranging. They can be anywhere from wildfires to droughts, floods, heat and cold extremes, which are involved with the melting and retreat of our glaciers, sea ice and snow caps, as well as changes and increases in temperature of the oceans that contribute to eustatic sea level change, as well as ocean acidification, and a broad range of factors that we need to consider as we address these climate impacts for robustness, adaptation, and mitigation.
So, over this kind of spectrum of time, over the last, few decades of time, one way of thinking about the kind of the changing dynamic on this topic of climate change is, I think, a sort of a transition from kind of understanding what climate change is and how it will impact, civilization really, and infrastructure with respect to the Corps of Engineers or the Army. And the transition, it seems to me, is now, yes, we need to understand that, but we also need to act, right? Interventions are called for, whether in the context of mitigation or, primarily, I think, within the work within the Corps of Engineers, how we adapt in that context. Can you reflect on that in regards to the work ERDC is undertaking? Are we seeing that kind of transition from both understanding the science of this, but also in formulating ways in which engineering solutions can be brought forward for consideration and actual implementation?
Right. So that there's many different considerations there. My belief is that ERDC is providing the requisite science and technology to ensure that we are able to find ways across our military installations and civil works programs to strategically adapt. For example, one type of project is forecast informed reservoir operations, which allows us to move beyond understanding that once water hits the ground, we start managing the project, to understanding atmospheric rivers and how they create potential for precipitation, for us to have strategic and proactive operations of these reservoirs going forward. So that's an important new emerging technology that we can use. And in the installations arena, we're now looking at, what can we do to create smart infrastructure, networked infrastructure across the constellation of installations that allow us to become more effective and efficient in terms of wise use of energy and water and natural resources in our management plans going forward. So we provide a lot of support in terms of science and technology through research and development to strategically enable those capabilities. And one of the areas that I think is very important for us to have a conversation about is, where does law and policy need to be re-examined to allow for science and technology to be best optimized and used in applications where perhaps we need to make those changes.
Yeah, those are good examples, I think, of this kind of transition, and maybe mindset and practice in this topic area. Another that comes to mind is the kind of materials that we use, within engineering to develop, say, infrastructure. It's been estimated that on planet Earth, humans use concrete at such large quantities. In fact, it's been proposed and estimated that every year on the planet, enough concrete is poured in various ways to construct an 88-foot tall and 88-foot wide wall of concrete around the Earth at the equator. That's a lot of concrete. And it's also been estimated that, the manufacturing and use of concrete is responsible for as much as 8 to 10% of CO2 emissions on an annual basis. So when you think about that, how, let's say in the environmental laboratory, does biology have something that can contribute to, the materials that we use to support, human life and development?
Yeah, that's a great question, great topic. In the environmental lab, we're looking at potential solutions that are in the field of biotechnology and synthetic biology, whereby we can, for example, in the area of concrete, create concrete out of locally available resources at the site of need and interest with a relatively lower CO2 production in the life cycle of the creation and use and ultimately disposal of those materials, and even going so far as to understanding, how can we also make that product capable of CO2 sequestration in a way that also provides an additional benefit besides the primary purpose of its application for, say, stabilization of permafrost, for terrain maneuvering, as well as the creation of airport pavement runways for in austere environments, which again, thinking about the life cycle, if you have to transport traditional Portland cement types of concrete materials to a remote austere site, that is also part of the life cycle of CO2 emissions. And so how do you then work locally to effect that solution?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for that answer. There are so many opportunities and targets in the engineering space to contribute to solutions for climate change. In previous ERDC LinkedIn events on this topic, there have been discussion about ERDC researchers performing work of various types. But in terms of key projects that you think of within the environmental laboratory, which you direct, what would be some of those projects that come to mind immediately?
Well, a few projects that we're working on, some research that is related to climate change would be one in the area of aquatic invasive and nuisance species. One example would be that, or concern would be that as we see climate change and biome shifts, what does that do to influence or encourage the movement of aquatic nuisance and invasive species, such as Asian carp? So some of the work we're doing is looking at, where are the carp right now in our nation's waterways with changes in biome shift. Where could they wind up going? What's the threat potential there for our assessment? And then what are the management actions that or measures that are tools we can provide and offer to the mission managers of projects to address the threat of Asian carp to the project and the benefits of those. So we wanted to limit that Asian carp exposure because they are a threat to native fisheries, recreational fisheries, sport fisheries, and also the ecology in general because they're voracious vegetative eaters.
Yeah.
Another area that we're looking at is the potential migration with biome shifts of the invasive zebra mussel. In that area, we're looking at innovative new surface coatings to test and observe in the field across a range of sites so that we can better understand how we can retard the aggregation of zebra mussels onto those panels, which represent surfaces such as our nation's infrastructure, locks and dams, other types of projects like intake structures that can get clogged and jammed from the accumulation of zebra mussels. And so that's a real threat to our infrastructure that we would like to be able to offer these innovative coating solutions toward for being able to reduce that risk and lessen the maintenance burden, lessen the infrastructure deterioration burden for the mission managers of those areas. Another area in environmental lab that we're working with regard to climate change is in looking at biome shifts and the impacts in the ecological modeling arena using models like EcoRest, where we are able to take a three-step approach in use of such resources, tools. First is for your ecosystem restoration and management project to establish it in a geospatial setting, a platform, as a basis to perform analysis. In the EcoRest tool, it's aggregated hundreds of habitat suitability indices models for fish and wildlife and habitats that we can then select from for the particular site and region in mind for being able to assemble those models and produce renderings of annual average habitat unit outputs, considering the changes in biome that we can simulate, and then play out a cost effectiveness incremental cost analysis so that we can understand what's the cost effectiveness, the ecosystem restoration efficiency, and long-term sustainability through that biome shift, so that we can understand for the investments made whether the project will perform as expected, or do changes need to be made to ensure that those investments are secured for the objectives that are desired.
Yeah, that's a great set of examples. I think of the fact that climate change is introducing new environmental stressors, sources of disturbance, and presses, changes in the environment that are going to be felt in a number of different ways. And being able to manage those environmental, conditions is, important to us. My next question, there are probably some in the audience that are wondering, how could Todd wait this long into the LinkedIn Live before he asked a question about engineering with nature? But as you know, in the Army Corps of Engineers, we have an initiative, a program that we call Engineering with Nature. I've led that program. We started it in 2010, and we've been working to highlight and elevate ways in which engineering and nature can be partnered, together to address challenges and to capture and realize, opportunities. So I'm going to ask you, and it's not a trick question, I'm not going to grade you or anything, but, from your perspective, what are the big opportunities for leveraging nature to address the challenges of climate change?
Right. So just a few maybe personal examples from experiences I've had, whereby we need to be able to better adapt and develop robustness for our coastal wetlands against relative sea level change and return period coastal storms, which are appearing to become more intense, more severe over time. And those coastal wetlands represent energy absorption that is critical as a first line of defense to our built infrastructure that protects our habitation and development. So what's very important about that is developing engineering with nature measures to affect alternatives for more robust and sustainable wetland features, especially considering the practical constraint. There's limited dollars out there. And what that means is that we need to be able to follow the science about how engineering and science about how these natural systems work, and be able to take calculated risks where there's no loss in life and property to then experiment with, demonstrate, develop the efficacy of various natural-based solutions as we, for example, build and rebuild and nourish coastal wetlands against these climate change effects of coastal storms and sea level rise. So those are the big opportunities. The process takes it takes building coalitions across natural resource agencies, stakeholders like landowners and elected officials, NGOs, and the general public, so that you can have an open slate about the conversation about affecting these solutions into practice, giving yourself permission to do discovery learning along the way. We understand that there are risks in performance of these features, and sometimes there may be failures, but we learn from those going forward. That whole process is a process of trust building with people that we build coalitions with. That trust is extremely important for them to give us the latitude to be beyond just regulated, but partnered with in terms of natural resource agencies, regulatory agencies who have oversight of the work that we do in that regard for many different areas. So it's very important to move that conversation along and ensure that we build a toolbox of experiences that we can draw upon, like the Engineering with Nature Atlases 1 and 2, which display many different projects across a wide range of habitats, both inland and coastal, that we can reflect on for that very purpose.
Right. Well, on that point, because you raised that, I think there's always mindsets are always in play. Especially with a problem, a challenge as large and seemingly overwhelming as climate change. And I think one mindset that we can, fall victim to is this idea of engineering or nature. That is, that there's some sort of bifurcated choice here. You got to pick one. And engineering with nature, we've worked hard to say, no, we can go with both, right? And you've referred to these books. We published both of them with a very specific purpose in mind, is to showcase examples, practical examples of built projects where it's and. It's not or. It's not engineering or nature. It's engineering and nature working mutually together. And I know for a fact that of the 118 projects around the world that are included in these books, you had a hand personally in several of them over your career. And when you think about those projects that you were involved with, I'm going to ask you this question about innovation. Because there's nothing easy about substantive innovation. Change is a difficult human kind of process. And when you think about that, what do you gather are the kind of the ingredients that enable the kind of innovation that's necessary to advance our practices and this partnership between engineering and nature?
Well, I'll draw upon an example. One of the projects in the atlases is on Chandelier Sound in southeast Louisiana. Many years ago, when I was an operations manager, I wanted to tell a story about this. Is that I went out to inspect one of our navigation entrance channel dredging projects, which was being performed by an ocean or seagoing cutterhead dredge, very powerful, large piece of equipment. And the project called for dredging the material and placing it in the designated open water disposal site adjacent to the channel, approximately 3,000 feet. So I went to visit the project, and in that process, observed that the short line it was on, a 3,000-foot line, had a baffle plate on the end of it to disperse the energy and provide
literally a sheet of steel at the end of the pipe.
Correct.
Yep.
Yes, to provide back pressure on the pipeline. And I asked the inspector. I said, "Well, what's the need for the back pressure plate?" He said, "Well, this piece of equipment is so large and powerful, it actually needs to be pumping against a sufficient amount of pressure to actually run energy efficient." And so I said, "Well, let me ask a question." This goes to the innovation. And innovation isn't just always about just high-end science and technology, but just practical speak in terms of engineering with nature. I said, that island over there, Breton Island, how far away is that island? He said, "Oh, it's about another 2,000 feet from here." I said, "Well, why aren't we pumping the dredge material to the island?" "Well, that's outside of the federal standard-based plan." I said, "Really?" Well, if you were to supplant that back pressure plate with an equivalent amount of pipeline, how many more feet could you go? He said, about another 2,000 feet. And I said, well, um, next time I think we're going to try and pump it to the island here because we can do that under the federal standard base plan instead of a back pressure plate. And so the next dredging cycle, we pumped almost 1 million cubic yards into the surf zone of Breton Island, which was an island that was eroding and disappearing. And so we nourished the project by placing material in nodes seaward of the shore, which allowed for natural processes to sort the materials and roll them up onto the beach, whereby we would re-nourish that habitat and sustain those features. So it's just, sometimes it's simple common sense to engineer with nature to affect solutions that are good for the civil works project and good for the environment, really at no extra cost, but we're working with and engineering with nature.
That's a great lead into the next question. But we want to hear from the audience, and we'd like to encourage you to, put questions that you might have for us in the chat feature and LinkedIn, and we're going to take those in due course. So we hope to hear from you in doing that. But so along the lines of beneficial use of sediment, Edmond, you know that in just round numbers, we dredge within the core something like 200 million cubic yards of sediment every year, and we're currently applying 30 to 40% of that for beneficial purposes, as you've outlined. But as you think about the future of beneficial use, whether in rivers or in bays and estuaries or in coastal environments, what opportunities do you see to work with our partners and collaborators, across USACE, with our cost share partners in the country, with other government agencies, even with private industry, in order to, to innovate, to, if you will, produce revolutionary amounts of beneficial use? What do you think are the top opportunities to do that kind of partnering and collaboration?
Well, I'll give you one specific example. It involves the dredging of the Houston Ship Channel's entrance way, whereby not that long ago, back in 2015, we worked as the Galveston District with the Galveston Parks Board and Texas General Land Office, who were our partners, cost share partners, on a project to perform beneficial use of dredge material for the protection of the Galveston Island seawall. It's an aging infrastructure, which we looked at beneficial use to recreate a beach line that had eroded away over the many years. And for the first time in 2015, we actually took material that would have otherwise gone to the ocean dredge material disposal site and had been dispersed pretty much without benefit, to then place it as a suitable material for reconstructing the beach there as a humongous opportunity. The first placement was about 350,000 cubic yards, and it was a test run to determine, the efficacy. And through observations over time, we found, wow, this material really has longevity. It's staying there. So in 2019, approximately 700,000 yards were placed there to extend the benefits of that project. And right now, in 2021, this summer, approximately 1 million cubic yards are being placed there because it's been found to be so beneficial that it's actually stuck there. It provides multiple benefits that we should take stock of, one of which is reducing the wave energy against the Galveston seawall and the toe stone to reduce maintenance and repair requirements going forward in the future from direct exposure. Another is that it creates both a combination of habitat for fish and wildlife, as well as an opportunity for recreation and tourism on the island. We were to understand that the Parks Board had used to truck material in, sand in, from borrow sites at $48 a cubic yard in the past. And when we switched and partnered with them under this project, for example, that brought their cost equivalent down to about $11 per cubic yard. So it stretched their limited dollars, and it provided for greater impact and value to the island and to the nation in the process. So what we need to do is consider that as a force, an EWN force multiplier, if you will, and to think outside of the box. We have to give ourselves permission to perform discovery learning, take risks, be willing to be accountable for those, and then broaden the spectrum of benefits through these strategic partnerships in ways that we can achieve those outcomes in ways not otherwise currently possible, but through thought, leadership, and innovation.
Sometimes it's okay to run with scissors.
Yes.
I mean, I like that example for so many reasons, and one of which is because, dredging and beneficial use of sediment has been a part of the Galveston Island story for over 100 years. In the hurricane in 1900, the first few miles of that seawall were constructed over 100 years ago. And part of that project in restoring, that island and creating resilience, essentially not a word used then, but a word we'd use today for that island, was dredging 12 million cubic yards of sand and placing it behind that seawall, raising the elevation of Galveston Island to what it is today. And this is a continuation, an adaptation of that practice that you're talking about here to extend the functional life, of a vital infrastructure project. So that's a great example. When you think about, and we've been going a long time already, this is the way you and I talk, but what are some things that ERDC is doing specifically to help with beneficial use, to support innovation in this space so that we can make more use of sediment for the types of purposes that you just described?
Right. So, ERDC partners with districts in many cases to achieve that. I'll give you one good example I like to talk about because I was the first design engineer for it. It's on the Chapalaya River bayous Cheyenne, Buff, and Black in Horseshoe Bend. In that Horseshoe Bend in the early 1990s, the sedimentation pattern started to accrete materials to where we needed to start actually performing maintenance dredging in that location to allow for the passage of commercial waterborne commerce navigation. And so the maintenance dredging led to the creation of wetlands in a particular site to the west of the Horseshoe, but we quickly exhausted that site and had few alternatives going forward, one of which was pumping it a long distance into the bay, which would have been very expensive, but another practical, risky, but worthwhile endeavor was to demonstrate the efficacy of placing that material on top of an existing shoal in the middle of the bend to then contribute and add sediment to the island, whereby we would expand it and create for efficiency increases in hydraulic conveyance between Horseshoe Bend and its bifurcated channel crew boat cut, whereby we would then allow for greater sediment scour and sustainability going forward. The ERDC in 2012 and beyond was asked to go and take a look at that project and determine through the multiple placements since that demonstration project, how has the Horseshoe Bend Island evolved? What benefits has it created for not only navigation, but the environment? And so it was found that the island did expand successively with each dredge material placement of about 1 million cubic yards about every 1 to 3 years over a good half a dozen or more placements. And it continues today. It will continue. The island has been sustainably growing since that time. It's evolved and matured an ecological habitat and has then produced rookeries for coastal birds like ibis and heron and wren. And so the ERDC was able to quantify the habitat evolution and fish and wildlife occupation of that feature for ecological benefits that arose out of a navigation project without any additional significant effort or cost In fact, it created cost savings and synergies with the hydraulic conveyance of sediment that would allow for more safe, more reliable navigation right around the proximity of a great feature, which I believe was recognized with 3 or 4 awards by dredging related industries and going forward. So
Yeah.
that was an example of where ERDC contributed to and supported the strategic enabling of documenting the benefits that came out of that project from multiple perspectives, and serves as an exemplar going forward in the art of the possible.
Yeah. And that's a great project example. And for those who are interested in learning more about that project, they can find more information about it on our Engineering with Nature website. And it has won many awards. It's a great example of the kinds of things you're emphasizing. I think we probably want to transition to taking a few questions from our audience, and I would encourage audience members who would like to submit questions online, and we can take them as time permits, and maybe we can follow up with some other questions. We didn't get through all our list, which was sort of predictable for you and I in a discussion on this topic. So one of the questions I'll say here, one of our former team members, Brigadier General retired David Turner, is asking, and is our viewing audience today, he's asking, he wants to know how USACE is implementing their climate change policy in projects, and further how USACE is influencing on a kind of global perspective, since climate change is a global challenge. I've had this experience personally many times. There are lots of audiences around the world that pay attention to what the Corps does. That doesn't mean we have every answer. We do not, but there are lots of audiences out there that look at the Corps to see what we're doing. So what are your thoughts about that in terms of our approach to climate change, the actions that we're taking?
Well, that's a great question. And so in the Corps of Engineers in the Civil Works program, we do perform feasibility studies to determine whether there would be a recommended plan that could be considered for authorization and appropriations toward construction. In that process, in more recent years, the Corps of Engineers has developed climate change related policy and procedures in the planning process for us to better understand what the driving uncertainties are around these water resources systems at landscape scale. What are the stressors? How are those stressors changing with climate into the future? And then of those drivers, one being relative sea level change, others being patterns of inhabitation and development. For example, how do we test for robustness of the alternatives that we develop and determine where the fatal flaws may be, to either evolve those alternatives or discard them, and then winnow those down towards a recommended plan, which we continue to build robustness into for the life cycle of the project that is authorized.
Right. Thanks, Edmond, for that. Another question, how USACE and ERDC is collaborating with other federal agencies for a whole of government approach to climate change.
And I think that coming out of the executive orders, we do still have some work to do. We need to collaborate with our partners, and I think we heard a little bit of that at the EWN workshop this week among a host of players, to include folks like NOAA, who are in charge of coastal observations, for example, where we need to develop efficiencies and synergies across our mission sets, our authorities, our programs, to better understand how we can create values where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. That's going to be additional work that will take additional initiative of agency leadership to forge and strengthen those relationships going forward, so that we can pool our resources in a scarce resource environment. There's always a need for more resources, but the way we address this strategically is pooling those resources to create value and impact that's otherwise not achievable. And again, I think we're still on that journey.
Yeah. I mean, I'd add in response to that question, within the Engineering with Nature initiative, it's really been about collaboration and partnership from the very beginning. One expression of that is an event that we're going to have next month on the 16th of September. We've been working for 5 years, to develop international guidelines on the use of natural and nature-based features like islands and wetlands and reefs and beaches and dunes to contribute to flood risk management. And we've developed this 1,000-page guideline document through collaboration. In fact, across the federal government, NOAA has been a huge partner in that, USGS and others, but not stopping there, also working with academia and working with governments in other countries, as well as working with the private sector. So it's truly a multi-sector effort to collect best practice and emerging practice from across the globe, including examples around the globe, so that we can all benefit from what each other are doing, because these challenges are enormous and action is required, and we want to draw from the best to be able to inform our future projects. You mentioned, our workshop this week. We had a workshop this week, really engineering with nature across the Department of Defense. We had all the services represented. We had NOAA and Fish and Wildlife and NGOs represented in this workshop, because it really kind of is I would call it a whole of society problem, right? You have to be working across sectors to be able to draw the best ideas forward so that they can be implemented in a position. And it's, I think, increasingly urgent that we engage in that kind of substantive collaboration to make progress.
Right, and it's also about collaboration for exchange of innovation thoughts and ideas, because not one of us can pretend that we have all of the solutions, but when we collaborate, not only to pool resources but to pool ideas, is a very powerful value proposition to engender for the nation.
Yeah. Here I'm going to combine a couple of questions together because I think they're suitable to be combined. And it is a challenge, and it is ways in which, the Corps of Engineers, or the Army for that matter, will pursue future infrastructure that will be sustainable and resilient with respect to climate change. Now, the easy answer would be, well, to focus on the elevation. How high does the levee have to be, or the beach and the dune need to be? But beyond that, including the other question related to ocean acidification, that's another element of this. The changing chemistry of the environment under climate change and how that influences potentially infrastructure. So, what are your thoughts, about this? How we prepare for and build infrastructure for the 21st century condition?
Right. Well, that's some good points in terms of whole of government approach too, as well. There are areas that the Corps of Engineers does not have within its mission set, but other agencies do, as well as the role of private industry and corporations and businesses. For example, the management of sediment and nutrients that come down rivers and streams to sea bodies such as the Gulf of Mexico. Those create dead zones in some cases and affect fisheries resources, but in addition is harmful to the coastal wetlands as well, and creates in some cases harmful algal blooms that are toxic to both animals and people. So those are really important for us to address. But on the flip side, for the Corps of Engineers, in terms of engineering with nature, we need to look at combinations of built and natural infrastructure that are not considered brittle to failure. And what I mean by that is under extreme forcings that result in catastrophic losses. Going forward, for us to be sustainable and resilient on a landscape scale, we need to ensure that our projects do incorporate engineering with nature principles and practices for nature-based solutions that are fully integrated with built infrastructure in ways that provide that sustainability and resilience in terms of resist, absorb, recover, and adapt. A good example of that would be under the Coastal Texas Protection and Restoration Study, which I believe is going to have a chief's report soon, which is a great achievement for the Galveston District and the General Land Office, who are the partners in that project. One of the features there, instead of building an earthen levee on Bolivar Peninsula, the concept was to engineer with nature and use nature-based solutions in combination with built infrastructure to create a multiple dune and beach shoreline system, basically using mass as the solution, sediment mass in a natural way that is able to be flexible and move with hydrologic force, hydrodynamic forcings of surge and wave, but still reduce the risk of inundation and flooding, working in close combination with a surge barrier at the intersection between Galveston Island and Bolivar Peninsula for a built infrastructure solution, a set of surge barrier gates that are navigable on the Houston Ship Channel. So the integration of those pieces are ways to create for sustainability and resilience and to avert brittle systems failures.
Yeah. As you were responding to that question, I couldn't help reflect upon my experience this summer. My wife and I did about 5,500 miles. We called it Engineering with Nature on the Road. And I blogged during that entire trip, and it's on our website. But, in experiencing fire, because we spent a lot of time in the West. And it was almost like going through a thermocline for those limnologists and oceanographers out there. Once we got past a certain point, there was smoke, evidence of fire in the western United States. And when we started coming back south, all of a sudden the smoke cleared and we were back in the, more southern portions of the country. And the range of challenges we have to respond to, including wildfire, which is such a serious issue. When we were in Montana this summer, at the time we were there were 30 large incident fires going on around the state. And there's a lot to respond to. And we don't necessarily think about, the landscape itself being infrastructure that we have to manage, but it's true with respect to something like wildfire. Another question that Matthew asks here is, examples of examples of buy-in from local partners, right? Cities and counties and at the state level for new ways, right? Something beyond, past practice. And I think this relates to this idea of kind of whole of government, but we have government across federal, state, and local, right? And there needs to be obviously an integration across that to be able to deliver projects on the ground at a local place and time that's going to address the need. So can you reflect on that? I'm sure your Galveston experience is part of that, but go ahead.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Oftentimes, the partners, the non-federal sponsors, would like for the Corps to stretch beyond our traditional solutions for a variety of reasons. One would be the broadening of the spectrum of benefits, but the creation of resiliency and sustainability at greater cost efficiencies and effectiveness, because obviously the scarcity of the non-federal cost share funds for both study and construction, operations, and maintenance. As a practical matter, it can make or break the partnership going forward. So the idea of being able to take science-informed, calculated risks is an important concept to engender. One way that we can manage that risk is to perform scaled pilot demonstration projects to test the efficacy of different combinations of features that are meant to achieve certain water resources management objectives, and then quantify the performance of those so that we can select the best performing features for robustness going forward in terms of adaptability, sustainability, and resilience, and show that and demonstrate not only to ourselves as the Corps, but to interested and affected parties that these features do work, and we've quantified that through science and engineering.
One of the questions asked Tyler in our audience is an important one, and that is, what examples can you offer in regards to partnering, collaborating with the private sector in delivering innovative solutions with respect to climate change? I mentioned, the international guidelines on natural nature-based features. The private sector was very much a part of that activity. Several companies around the world contributing to that effort in kind to bring their projects and practices forward. But other examples that you can think of that you have experience with or ERDC is involved with, the private sector is a very important partner in the innovation enterprise.
Right. So, an important concept would be public-private partnerships or public-public-private partnerships, P3 or P4. And there, I'll just give you one example, is on flood risk management, whereby, especially for the purpose of social equity, there are some communities around the country that are flood prone, whether it's nuisance flooding or greater than nuisance flooding, that impact the lives of underrepresented communities who do not have necessarily the means to recover from floods and provide for resilience through insurance or other means to safeguard their property, their livelihoods. So one example, in fact, that we're exploring right now with private industry is the idea of how can we develop a public-private partnership with the insurance industry, who's on the hook to pay out on losses in many cases of these flood risks of property damage, and how do we work with them to understand those risks and ameliorate those risks, especially in underserved communities, to arrive at social equity that is a great value to our nation. Many of the people who are in these communities are the backbone of the middle class society and perform many jobs in industry that we take for granted in producing products for the United States that otherwise in the white collar community are receiving the benefits of, but don't take for granted the work of the blue collar communities who serve those needs and may be vulnerable to these types of impacts. So to bring in private industry through a P3 or P4 approach, for example, those insurance companies and reinsurance companies, is a really powerful value proposition going forward.
Yeah. Another way in which we're doing this, just had a leadership call before this event today of our network for engineering with nature. So last year, the Corps of Engineers and the University of Georgia worked together to stand up the network. And we just had a leadership call this afternoon of partners. It's an open, collaboration forum that includes opportunities for the private sector as well as academia, as well as government, to work together in this space of engineering with nature. Because again, it requires an all of society approach. We all have to pull together, I think, across that spectrum to be able to deliver the kinds of solutions that we need. One of our questions, I think here, what does the future look like? That's always an interesting activity to engage in. And there are two ways you can think about this. What does the future look like? If we don't achieve or make progress toward environmental sustainability. Another way to look at this is, what does the future look like if we do, make progress toward environmental sustainability? So how do you think about that?
To some of the ways that we perform our flood risk management studies, in many cases, we don't consider the costs involved from the life cycle perspective of response to catastrophic events where other federal agencies' resources and money are brought to bear to recover from these disasters. And so we need to take a more holistic view of how the federal government as a whole is involved from cradle to grave of water resources projects, and take stock of that, because they're real. Those costs are real, those resources are real, and the applications to respond to catastrophe are there.
Yeah.
So that's really important to take into consideration.
Yeah, I think maybe, maybe by way of kind of wrap up a little bit here, because we've been going at it for an hour. This is a relatively short conversation for you and I, but for people sitting in front of their computers, it's a very long one. But, I think we need to be aware of, the challenges, the risks, so that we have a sufficient sense of urgency, about action. And for an engineering organization, as we are, science and an engineering organization, that's a source of motivation, that the work that we're doing is important, right? And the work that we're doing is relevant, and the work that we're doing is now, right? This is not, 20 years in the future. This is work that needs to be done now, and we need to be delivering solutions now. But we also need to be thinking about, kind of what the future will look like when we're successful, right? Because I think it's easy to get trapped in the kind of the negative, view, and sometimes that's paralyzing. Not just to people in maybe the general public as they think about the size of this problem, but even for engineers and scientists. I mean, so we need to think about both at the same time when we can. The negative that we want to avoid, but also the positive that we want to strive for, so that we are sufficiently and comprehensively motivated to address this challenge with climate change.
Right, and we can't not afford to take that posture going forward. Climate change impacts are real. They come in combinations. They become compound hazards on systems in context of stressors and drivers. That's a forward-leaning area of research, that we understand compound multiple hazards that are occurring simultaneously, and how do we understand, predict, and shape outcomes going forward to get to that future end state that we want to be at as a nation for long-term robustness, sustainability, and resilience.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Edmond, for agreeing to join us here and for being, the subject of my interrogation. It's been great to be talking with you. And you've given me something else here to say. That's right. We couldn't get through everybody's questions, today. And we would like to invite you, to submit, questions even after the fact to the website, or not to the website, but to the email address that you're going to see on the screen. We would like to hear from you. Those of you that have thoughts and additional ideas, especially, how that we can be working together and collaborating with each other to solve these questions. It is going to take a very broad scale partnership and collaboration and work across sectors to deliver solutions for this challenge, and we do want to hear from you. So we will do our best to respond to your questions, individually after this event, but we want to hear from you. We want to hear about your opportunities, your thoughts about opportunities where we can work together on these challenges. So thank you very much for being with us today.